1 year ago, Donald Trump looked like he had the entire North American board under his thumb: emergency tariff powers, instant escalation, 25% on Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy and potash, tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, tariffs on autos, threats to rip up the trade pact he himself negotiated. No patience, no subtlety, just pressure, raw pressure, the kind designed to make the other side blink first. But as of today, that arsenal looks very different. IEEPA. Dead. The U.S. Supreme Court struck it down, ruling Trump went beyond his authority by using an emergency powers law to impose sweeping tariffs. The biggest gun on the table is gone. More than $175 billion in tariff collections now sit under potential refund pressure, and the replacement. Section 122. A temporary 10% import duty for 150 days, not the unlimited emergency hammer Trump wanted, and one that explicitly exempts CUSMA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico. That is not the same weapon. Not even close. 1 year ago, Trump held every card. Today, he lost his ace, the emergency tariff machine. That made every trading partner wonder what would hit next has been cut down by the highest court in the United States. And here is what almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is putting together. Every failure did not just weaken Trump. Every failure handed Mark Carney and Canada a new piece of leverage. The court defeat narrowed Washington's options. The fallback tariff came with a countdown clock, and the next battlefield, the 2026 CUSMA review window, is taking shape in a legal and political environment that is far less favorable to Trump than the one he started with. So subscribe, because the summer 2026 CUSMA review window is the crescendo of everything you are about to see: the court ruling, the temporary fallback, the sectoral tariff fights, the business paralysis, the supply chain math. It all converges there, not as separate stories, as one story. Trump's most dangerous move was not steel, not aluminum, not autos. It was IEEPA, because IEEPA let him wrap tariffs in the language of emergency that mattered. Emergency powers move fast. They create shock. They create uncertainty. They force companies to freeze, recalculate, and beg for clarity later. And Trump used that law to hit China, Canada, Mexico, and then most U.S. trading partners with so-called reciprocal tariffs. It was designed as a presidential shortcut around the normal, slower, messier trade process. That shortcut is now gone. In a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court said IEEPA did not give the president tariff authority. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that the power to regulate importation is not the power to impose tariffs. And that matters far beyond one case, because the court was not just narrowing one tactic. It was reasserting that tariffs of enormous economic consequence need clearer authority from Congress. That is a structural defeat, not a messaging defeat, a structural defeat. And notice the pressure this creates. The Penn-Wharton budget model told Reuters that more than $175 billion in tariff collections could be exposed to refund demands after the ruling. That means the administration is not just fighting a legal loss. It is fighting the financial aftershocks of its own strategy, when your strength suddenly comes with refund exposure, legal retreat, and a frantic search for substitute powers. That is not leverage. That is backfire. Carney's win from this domino is not that Canada caused the ruling. It is that Canada instantly benefits from what the ruling destroys. The broad emergency threat is gone. The negotiation climate changes. The White House has to operate with weaker tools, slower tools, more contested tools. Trump wanted a cannon. He is now cycling through replacements. Domino 1 is down. Trump's answer to the IEEPA loss was Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. The White House presented it as proof the tariff pressure would continue. And yes, pressure continues. But this is where the marketing and the mechanics split apart, because Section 122 is weaker in exactly the ways that matter most. First, it is smaller. The White House announced a 10% ad valorem import duty, not the open-ended emergency architecture Trump had been using. Smaller hit, smaller blast radius, smaller intimidation factor. Second, it is temporary, 150 days. That is not a doctrine. That is a timer, a countdown disguised as a strategy. The White House said the duty took effect on February 24, 2026, which means the new pressure campaign did not replace the old one with permanence. It replaced it with a fuse. Third, it is full of exemptions, energy, certain critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, some electronics, passenger vehicles and certain parts, aerospace products, and most importantly for this fight, USMCA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico. Read that again. Trump's post-IEEPA fallback explicitly leaves a protected lane open for compliant North American trade. That is not total economic siege. That is selective pressure with giant escape hatches. And that is why the political theater starts to crack. Trump can still posture. He can still threaten. He can still keep steel, aluminum, and auto fights alive. But his replacement weapon is capped by time, narrowed by design, and softened by exemptions that matter precisely where Canada has the most to gain. Carney does not need Section 122 to disappear tomorrow. He only needs it to be what it is, a weaker instrument arriving after the strongest one already died. Carney's win from this domino is time, time to negotiate, time to diversify, time to force every boardroom in North America to ask the same question. If the White House had to downgrade from emergency power to a temporary surcharge, who is really improvising now? Domino 2 is falling. This is the one that sounds terrifying on cable news. Trump could scrap CUSMA. Trump says the U.S. does not need USMCA. The pact is up for review, all true, all serious, but serious is not the same as immediate. The actual process matters here, and process is where the fear campaign starts to lose altitude. According to the Congressional Research Service, the first joint review begins on July 1, 2026. If all three countries confirm continuation in writing, the agreement automatically extends for another 16 years. But if they do not all confirm, the agreement does not instantly vanish. Instead, annual joint reviews continue until the parties agree to extend it or until the agreement reaches its scheduled 2036 termination point. That is a delayed threat, not a guillotine. And while public rhetoric has been loud, the underlying preparation tells a different story. The U.S. and Mexico launched discussions in March to prepare for the review. Canada says private government-to-government conversations have not been discouraging and is trying to wrap sectoral solutions on steel, aluminum, and autos into the broader review environment. In other words, while Trump performs uncertainty, the machinery of negotiation is already moving. Now look at Carney's mirror defense. He spent the year building exactly the kind of posture you would want if the next fight was about continental supply chains. He promised an all-in-Canada auto network. He targeted U.S. vehicles in a way that spared auto parts and protected Mexican content. He kept retaliation aimed for maximum U.S. pain and minimum Canadian damage. He even offered relief to Canada-based automakers and manufacturers that kept producing and investing at home. That is not random retaliation. That is selective fortification. So yes, the CUSMA review is a threat, but it is a slow-moving one, shaped by law, by process, and by industrial reality. And Canada has spent the entire year turning compliance, supply chain integration, and targeted countermeasures into armor. Domino 3 is wobbling. Now for the supreme irony. Trump's own signature trade deal, the agreement he sold as the replacement for NAFTA, has become one of Canada's biggest shields. His fallback Section 122 tariff explicitly exempts USMCA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico. Brookings notes that over 85% of imports from Canada and Mexico continue to enter the United States duty-free when they are USMCA-compliant. So the very framework Trump once branded as his victory has become the structure limiting how much damage he can inflict without detonating North America's integrated production system. That is the irony at the center of this whole story. Trump tried to weaponize emergency law against Canada. The courts killed it. He pivoted to a temporary tariff statute. That statute carved out USMCA-compliant Canadian trade. He threatens the pact itself, but the pact does not instantly die on July 1st, and every month of uncertainty only reminds businesses how badly they need the rules to survive. His own architecture keeps becoming Carney's shield, and now look at the convergence. Because the summer 2026 window is unlike anything in modern North American trade politics. Same window, the July 1st joint review begins. Same window, Section 122E's 150-day clock is running toward expiration in late July. Same window, the White House is dealing with the aftershocks of the Supreme Court's IEEPA defeat. Same window, steel, aluminum, and auto tariff negotiations are still unresolved. Same window, businesses are delaying investment because nobody wants to bet billions on a rulebook Washington keeps threatening to torch. Now contrast that with Carney's position. Calm. Not because Canada is invulnerable. It is not. Canada still sends around 70% of its exports to the United States. But calm because he spent the year building alternatives and bargaining chips at the same time. Reuters reported he has pushed to diversify trade away from the U.S., build partnerships abroad, and frame the CUSMA review as the place to build a new relationship rather than submit to the old one. That is not panic, that is preparation. And the numbers tell you why the Americans cannot simply brute force their way through this. Canada and Mexico are the top sources of U.S. crude imports, together accounting for around 1/4 of the oil U.S. refiners process into fuel. Roughly half of all aluminum used in the U.S. is imported, and the vast majority of that imported. Aluminum comes from Canada, 3.2 million tons in the Reuters tally, more than the next 9 countries combined. You can threaten your supplier, you can punish your supplier, but if you are structurally dependent on your supplier, every hit echoes back. Let's connect this to your daily life, because this outcome is not an abstraction. The US-Canada border handles over $2.5 billion in trade a day. This is energy, manufacturing, food, auto parts, metals, consumer goods. When tariffs hit that machine, the price does not stay wrapped in a policy memo. It shows up in factory orders, gasoline prices, packaging costs, vehicle prices, and local employment. Look at Windsor, Ontario, one of the places that feels this first and feels it hardest. Reuters reports manufacturers there saw orders dry up, customers demand longer payment terms, and investment decisions freeze under the cloud of tariff and CUSMA uncertainty. Manufacturing accounts for nearly 1/4 of employment in the Windsor-Essex region. About 90% of the city's exports cross the border, often multiple times during production. When tariff threats intensify, the pain is not theoretical. It moves from the trade desk to the shop floor, and then the second-order effects kick in. Reuters found Windsor's businesses paused investments, delayed production, and cut jobs at the height of the uncertainty. Apprenticeship demand weakened. One manufacturing program at St. Clair College was suspended because of low demand. Residential sales fell faster than the national average. That is what a trade war does when supply chains are fused together. It spreads every bolt, every shipment, every paycheck. So when you hear this discussed like a game of speeches and threats, remember what is actually at stake. In Canada, millions of jobs are tied to exports to the United States. In the U.S., refiners depend on Canadian and Mexican crude. U.S. aluminum buyers depend heavily on Canadian metal. Auto production depends on components crossing the border again and again and again. This is not one country firing at another from a distance. This is 2 economies strapped together arguing over who gets to breathe. Let me lay out the scorecard one final time. Carney's wins. IEEPA is gone. Trump's biggest legal weapon is dead. Section 122 is temporary. Section 122 is narrower. CUSMA-compliant Canadian goods keep a protected lane. Canada's targeted retaliation on steel, aluminum, and autos remains in play. Canada built domestic supports, from liquidity measures to worker support to auto sector fortification. Canada is also negotiating sectoral solutions while simultaneously diversifying trade. Abroad, Trump's losses. The Supreme Court clipped his emergency tariff power. More than $175 billion in collections are exposed to refund pressure. His replacement tariff is smaller and on a clock. His own CUSMA framework shields compliant Canadian trade. His tariff pressure continues to hit industries that depend on Canada's oil, metals, and integrated manufacturing. And every time he threatens to blow up the deal, he also deepens the business case for Canada, Mexico, and U.S. industry to lock in rules, not chaos. This is the mastermind summary. Carney did not win by being louder. He won by being patient, by letting the law narrow Trump's room to maneuver, by retaliating selectively, by protecting domestic production while punishing exposed U.S. vulnerabilities, by building at home, by building abroad, by turning CUSMA compliance into armor. Trump, by contrast, kept reaching for shock faster, broader, harder. But continental trade is not a rally stage. It is a structure. And when you hit the structure too hard, the recoil starts to hit you to So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. When all sides sit down in the summer 2026 CUSMA review window with IEEPA gone, with Section 122 running on borrowed time and with Trump's own trade pact still shielding compliant Canadian goods, what card does Trump actually have left? And if your answer is steel, aluminum, autos, and pure uncertainty, does that sound like strength? Or does that sound like a shrinking arsenal? Subscribe, turn on notifications. The countdown to the 2026 CUSMA review is running. This story is not winding down, it is moving into the most important window yet,